She sold handmade blankets to survive. Then the cowboy bought them all and changed her life forever. A true story. There is a flea market on the edge of a small Texas town that sits between a feed store and an empty lot where somebody once tried to open a barbecue restaurant and gave up after one summer. The market opens on Saturday and Sunday mornings, usually around 7, and it smells like old wood and coffee from the thermos that the lady in the third stall always brings. Most people drive past it without stopping. A few turn in. And every now and then, something happens at that market that none of the regular vendors will ever forget. This is one of those stories. Her name was Maggie. That is what everyone called her. Not her full name, just Maggie, the way you call someone a name so many times over so many years that the longer version just stops existing. She was 53 years old, and she had been waking up tired for so long that she had almost stopped noticing it. Not sick tired, not sad tired, though there was some of that too. Just the kind of tired that builds up in a person when they have been carrying things alone for too long, and there is no one around to say, "Here, let me take some of that for a while." She lived in a double-wide trailer about 40 minutes outside of town, on a flat stretch of panhandle land where the wind came from the north in October, and did not really stop until March. The trailer was clean. She was particular about that. Whatever else was uncertain in her life, the trailer was always clean, the dishes always done, the floor swept before she went to bed. Small dignities. She had read somewhere once that small dignities were the things that kept a person together when the bigger picture was not looking good, and she had filed that away and held on to it the way you hold on to something useful. She had been married. That had ended 8 years before our story begins. Not dramatically, not with yelling or broken things or anything that makes for a dramatic scene in a movie. It ended the way a fire ends when you stop feeding it. Quietly, slowly, and then one morning there was just cold ash where something warm used to be, and both of them knew it, and they were decent enough to each other to say so out loud and part without bitterness. He moved to New Mexico. They still sent birthday texts, which she supposed was civilized. Her 2 kids were grown. Her son lived in Denver and called on Sundays when he remembered, which was most Sundays but not all. Her daughter lived in Houston and was busy with a new baby and a demanding job, and a husband who traveled for work, and Maggie loved her fiercely from a distance and tried not to call too often because she did not want her daughter to feel like she was needed in a way that added weight to an already heavy life. That is the particular loneliness of a good parent, learning to need your children quietly. She had worked at a grocery store on the edge of town for 9 years, stocking shelves, sometimes the register, occasionally the back room. It was not exciting work, but it was steady, and steady had been enough. Then the store got bought by a larger chain, hours got cut, the manager who had always been decent got replaced by a young man from corporate who communicated primarily through laminated policy notices taped to the break room door, and Maggie went from 30 hours a week to 18 hours a week in the space of 1 quarter. 18 hours a week, at her wage, did not cover the rent. Not anymore, because the rent had gone up. She had opened the letter from her landlord on a Tuesday evening in early September, standing at the kitchen counter still in her work vest, and she had read the number, and then she had read it again, and then she had set the letter down and stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing. She did not panic. She was not a panicking kind of person, but she did go sit at the kitchen table and put both palms flat on the wood, the way she did sometimes when things felt like too much, just to feel something solid underneath her. The table had been her mother's. It was old, and the finish was uneven in one corner from where a pot had been set down hot too many times, and it was the most reassuring thing she owned. She sat there for about 10 minutes. Then she got up, went to the closet, and pulled out her grandmother's sewing machine. Maggie had been sewing since she was 9 years old. Her grandmother had taught her on Saturday mornings at a kitchen table, not too different from the one she owned now, a woman with patient hands and a straightforward way of explaining things that made complicated stitches feel manageable. By the time Maggie was 12, she could follow any pattern she was given. By the time she was 16, she was adjusting patterns, fixing the things she didn't think were right. By the time she was an adult, sewing had become the thing she turned to when everything else felt uncertain. It was the one place where if you did the steps correctly, the result was always what you wanted it to be. There was comfort in that kind of reliability. She had made blankets for years, for her kids when they were small, for gifts, for herself on winter evenings when she wanted something to do with her hands while she watched television. Not regular flat blankets, heavy ones, quilted and stuffed with good batting, meant to actually keep a person warm. She used a pattern her mother had taught her called the Lone Star, a classic Texas design with a big 8-pointed star in the center, made from diamond-shaped pieces of fabric that had to be cut and aligned exactly right, or the whole thing went crooked. It was exacting work. She had always liked exacting work. It gave her somewhere specific to put her attention. That September night, sitting with the sewing machine out and a pile of fabric in her lap, she did some math. A good blanket, one she was proud of, one she would give to someone she cared about, took her about 3 evenings to complete. The materials cost around $12 to $15 if she was careful and bought from the discount fabric bins at the craft store in Amarillo. If she sold each one for $35, she made $20 profit per blanket. If she made 6 blankets a month, that was $120 extra dollars. Which was not enough to solve everything, but it was something. Something was what she had to work with. She looked up the flea market hours on her phone. Saturday and Sunday, 7 to 2. She could do that. She had the weekends free. She could be the person sitting behind the table with the blankets, if that was what it took. She decided that was what it took, and she started sewing. The first weekend at the market, she sold 1 blanket. She had brought 8 and sold 1 to an older woman who ran her fingers over the stitching and said it reminded her of something her aunt used to make. Maggie drove home with $35 and 7 blankets, and a feeling she recognized as not quite defeat, but not quite success either. Something in the middle that required more patience to sit with than either of the other 2. The second weekend she sold 3. The third, 2. Some weekends were better, some were worse. She settled into a rhythm of selling somewhere between 2 and 5 blankets per weekend, which averaged out to something that helped but did not save her. She was supplementing. She was treading water with slightly more energy than before, which is not the same as swimming toward shore, but is better than going under. She kept going anyway. That is the thing about Maggie that you need to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. She was not a woman who stopped. She had thought about stopping many times. Stopping the market, stopping the sewing, stopping the whole tired effort of trying to make a life work on the wrong side of the math. But she had a quality that is rarer than people think, which is that she could look at a situation clearly, see that it was hard and not improving quickly, and keep showing up anyway. Not because she was blindly optimistic, but because the alternative, staying home, giving up the small income, giving up the thing her hands were good at, felt worse than the effort. So she kept going. She learned the market. She learned which spots had the best foot traffic, which vendors would let her park beside them when the good spots were taken, which days were slower and why. She brought a good thermos of coffee because the mornings were cold, and standing behind a table in Texas panhandle wind without warm coffee was a particularly unpleasant kind of suffering. She brought a folding chair that she almost never sat in because she had noticed that people were more likely to stop and look when the vendor was standing and present, not sitting and scrolling on a phone. She greeted people, not in a pushy salesperson way. She hated that, and she could tell other people did too. Just a nod, a good morning, sometimes a comment about the weather or the cold. If someone picked up a blanket, she would tell them what was in it. This one is double stuffed. This one has flannel on the back so it's warmer on the skin. This one took me a little longer because the points on the star kept being stubborn. People liked hearing about the work. They liked knowing that someone had thought about the thing they were holding before they picked it up. She did not haggle desperately. That was important to her. When someone offered her $20 for a $35 blanket, she would smile and say she understood, but she couldn't do that because the materials alone were $12. Sometimes they walked away. Sometimes they came back. Either way, she kept her price, because the moment she started dropping it out of fear was the moment the whole thing started feeling like something she was ashamed of, and she could not afford to feel ashamed of the one thing that was keeping her going. It was the first Sunday of November when Jim showed up. She almost did not notice him at first, which was funny later when she thought about it, because he was not a small or unnoticeable man. He was tall, that particular lean tall of someone who has worked outside for 40 years and has no extra anything anywhere on his body. He wore a canvas work jacket that had clearly been washed hundreds of times, and a hat that was not a costume cowboy hat but the real kind, worn along the brim, shaped by years of actual use. His boots were the same, working boots, not display boots. There is a difference, and anyone from ranch country can see it immediately. He was not browsing. He had the purposeful walk of a man who had a specific thing to find and intended to find it efficiently. He walked down the main row of the market without slowing down, and Maggie watched him the way you watch a person who is interesting, without being sure why, and then he reached her table and he stopped. He did not stop the way people stopped when something caught their eye accidentally. He stopped deliberately, like he had made a decision, and he turned and looked at the blankets on her table. He picked one up, the blue and gold Lone Star that she was personally most proud of from that batch, and he held it with both hands and looked at it. Not the way most people looked at things at flea markets, which is a kind of scanning look, checking the general impression. He really looked at it. He turned it over and checked the back. He looked at the points of the star, where all the diamond pieces met in the center, which is the hardest part to get right, and the first place any experienced eye goes to check the quality. He rubbed the fabric between his fingers. Then he set it down, nodded once to himself, like he had confirmed something, and walked on. Maggie watched him go and thought, he knows what he's looking at. And then she poured more coffee from her thermos and helped a woman who wanted to know if the red and brown one was big enough for a full-size bed. He came back 20 minutes later. She noticed him from 2 stalls away, walking back with a slightly different expression than before, less purposeful, more settled, like a man who had been turning something over in his head and had arrived at where he wanted to land. He came and stood in front of her table again, and this time he looked at her, not the blankets. He said, without any preamble, "How many of these do you have right now, today, on this table?" Maggie blinked once, which was her version of being surprised. She counted. 19. He asked what she would take for all 19. Not 1 or 2, all of them. Right now, this morning, together. She had been at this market for 2 months, and no one had ever said anything remotely like that to her. She did the math in her head, 35 times 19, and told him $665. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a wallet that was also clearly not a prop. He counted out $700 in cash and put it on her table. He said, "Keep the rest for your trouble." Maggie looked at the money on her table. Then she looked at him. She was not a woman who got flustered, but she was a woman who needed a moment to process something genuinely unexpected, so she took one. She asked him what he wanted 19 blankets for, and that is when things got interesting. His name was Jim. He was 61 years old, and he ran a cattle ranch about 30 miles north of town. Not a small hobby ranch, but a real working operation. 4,000 acres of grassland, beef cattle, a full-time staff of ranch hands, and a handful of families who had worked his land for years, some of them for decades. His father had started the ranch. His grandfather before that had broken the first ground. He had grown up on it, left briefly for agricultural college, and come back and never left again. The land was not his hobby or his investment. It was just his life, in the plainest and most complete sense of the word. He had a wife, Eleanor. They had been married for 31 years, and she had been the kind of woman who, without making a big deal of it, was the warm center of everything around her. She was the one who remembered which ranch hand's kid was having a birthday. She was the one who organized the Christmas gathering every year for the ranch families. Not a fancy party, but a real one. The kind where children ran around and the men who worked outside all year stood around in their good shirts, looking slightly uncomfortable and pleased. And every year, without fail, Eleanor made a handmade blanket for each family and each man in the bunkhouse. It took her from October to December to make them all, working every evening, and she never once complained about it, because she didn't think of it as extra work. She thought of it as the point. Eleanor passed away 4 years before Jim stopped at Maggie's table. A sudden illness, the kind that does not give you long to prepare. And then she was gone in a way that left the whole ranch feeling different, in a way that Jim could not fully explain even to people he trusted. It was not just grief, though it was that. It was that the warm center was gone, and without it the edges of things felt less held together. The Christmas gathering had happened 3 more times without Eleanor. It was still good. People still came. The food was still there. The children still ran around. But the blankets had not come back. Jim had thought about it each October and had not known how to do what she had done, or who to ask, or whether asking would seem like he was trying to replace something that was not replaceable. So he hadn't done it. And there was a gap where those blankets used to be that he was aware of, even if he hadn't said so to anyone. That November morning, walking through a flea market for the first time in years, he had stopped at Maggie's table and picked up the blue and gold Lone Star blanket and known immediately that it was the real thing. Not a mass-produced item, not something knocked out for the tourist trade. Real stitching, real craft, real care. He could tell because Eleanor had done the same work, and he had watched her do it for 31 years, and quality in this particular form was something he knew how to recognize. He walked on. He found the tack vendor he had come for. He bought the part he needed. And then he stood by his truck in the parking lot for about 15 minutes, thinking about the blankets and the woman who had made them, and eventually he went back. He told Maggie all of this standing at her table, concisely, without any unnecessary sentiment. He was the kind of man who told the truth plainly, and expected the same back, and did not dress things up more than was needed. He said that he had 22 families on his ranch, and 11 men in the bunkhouse. He said that he wanted a blanket for each of them, 33 blankets, to be given at the Christmas gathering, which was on December 20th. He said he would pay for all the materials she needed, up front, at the store of her choice, and he would pay her per blanket on top of that, and he would add a completion bonus if they were done by December 15th. He told her the number. Maggie asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. She did not say yes immediately. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, quietly but directly, "I don't take charity." He didn't miss a beat. He said, "Neither do I. I need 33 blankets. Can you make them?" And that, she told her daughter later on the phone, was the exact right thing to say. She did not say yes that day. She said she would think about it, and she meant it. She took his card. Simple, just the ranch name and his number, nothing extra, and she drove home with 19 fewer blankets and $700 and a head full of thoughts that she needed to sort through quietly. There were real reasons to say no. She had never taken a commission before. Selling at a market was one thing. She made what she wanted. She priced it herself. If she fell a little behind, it only affected her. A commission was different. 33 blankets by a specific date for a real person who was paying real money was a commitment that could go wrong in ways that would embarrass her. And embarrassing herself in front of a stranger who had been decent to her was something she wanted to avoid. There was also the matter of simply not knowing him. He could have been exactly who he said he was, or he could have been someone with a good story and a believable face and no ranch anywhere. She had not lived 53 years without learning that the world contains people who are convincing liars. And then there was the other thing, the quieter thing, which was that the amount of money he had named would pay off every overdue bill on her kitchen counter, cover the rent increase for 4 months, and fix the truck. She was suspicious of anything that offered to fix that many things at once. It felt like the kind of offer that had a catch hiding somewhere, and she wanted to find the catch before she agreed to anything. So she called the number on the card the next morning, and when he picked up she told him she had 2 questions. First, could he give her the name of someone at the ranch she could call to verify he was who he said he was? Second, could he give her a few days to think it over? He said yes to both without hesitating, gave her his foreman's name and number, and said to take whatever time she needed. She called the foreman. He answered on the second ring, a man with a voice like gravel who had clearly been outside when she called because she could hear wind in the background. She said she was considering doing some work for Jim and wanted to understand who she'd be working with. He was quiet for a second, and then he said that in 15 years of working for the man, Jim Rourke had never once asked him to do something dishonest or treated a person unfairly, and that if he had made her an offer and shaken hands on it, or in this case, put cash on a table, he would honor it exactly as stated. That was enough for Maggie. She called Jim back that evening and said yes. He arranged for a truck from the ranch to take her to the fabric store in Amarillo 2 days later. She had made a list: specific wools, a particular weight of batting, flannel for backing, thread in 12 colors, needles, extra bobbins. The kind of list a person makes when they know exactly what they're doing and are not guessing at any of it. The ranch truck waited in the parking lot while she went through the store methodically, and everything went into the truck, and when she got home she had more quality material in one place than she had worked with in years. She cleared the dining room table. She moved the chairs to the walls, set up her cutting mat, organized the fabric by color along one side of the room, and stood back and looked at everything. 33 blankets. 12 weeks if she counted from Eleanor's tradition starting in October, but she had less than 6 weeks now, which meant she needed to make roughly 6 blankets per week. That was possible, not comfortable, but possible, if she was disciplined about it and did not let herself get too precious with each one. But then she looked at the list Jim had given her. He had handed her a folded piece of paper along with the fabric money, and on it was a handwritten list of all 33 recipients, family names, number of people in each family unit, ages of any children, and a short note about each person. 1 or 2 things they were known for, something they loved, a detail that made them a person rather than a name. The man who had worked the ranch for 32 years and was known for never missing a sunrise. The young couple who had just had their first baby in August. The teenage boy who had started as a summer helper and impressed everyone enough that he'd been kept on. The older woman who handled the ranch accounts and baked things that made everyone find excuses to be near the office. Maggie read through the list twice, and then she understood that this was not going to be 33 of the same blanket knocked out as fast as possible. She was going to make 33 different blankets for 33 different people. It was going to take everything she had. She went to bed that night already planning colors. The next 6 weeks were the most focused and purposeful she had spent in a long time. She woke at 5:30, which was earlier than her store shifts required, and she sewed for 2 hours before breakfast. She sewed again in the evenings, after dinner, until 10 or 11 at night. On the weekends, she sewed most of the day, taking breaks to stretch her back and walk around the trailer, because hunching over a sewing machine for hours without moving does not do a 53-year-old spine any favors. She matched colors to people. The 32-year veteran got a deep burgundy and black blanket with a complex border pattern, because a man who had given that much of his life to one place deserved the most careful work she could do. The family with the new August baby got a warm cream and yellow one with a softer, simpler pattern, and she added something she had not been asked for, a small matching square in the same fabric, infant-sized, tucked inside the folded blanket. She didn't mention it to Jim. She just made it because it seemed right. The teenage boy who had impressed everyone got a burnt orange and brown one, because she had been around enough young men from ranch country to know that a 17-year-old would wear burnt orange and brown and not feel embarrassed about it, and being given something you could actually use without feeling self-conscious mattered when you were 17. She made lighter, brighter ones for the families with young children. A child responding to color is one of the most reliable things in the world, and more muted, substantial ones for the older hands who probably had strong feelings about not having anything fussy in their space. She made each one as well as she possibly could, not because she was nervous about being judged, but because making something as well as you possibly can is the only way she knew how to make things. Jim called twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, in the late afternoon. He was consistent about it, which she appreciated. The calls were short. He asked if she had everything she needed. He asked if the timeline still looked manageable. She said yes to both, honestly, because they were both true. On the 3rd week he asked if she was enjoying the work, and the question caught her slightly off guard, because no one had asked her that in a while. She thought about it honestly and said yes, she was. She said it was different from her regular blankets, because she knew who each one was for, and knowing that made every decision, the color, the pattern, the weight, feel like it mattered in a specific way, rather than in a general way. He said, "Good, that's in the stitching. People can feel it when something was made for them. She thought about that for a long time after they hung up. She finished the 33rd blanket on December 13th, 2 days ahead of the deadline. She laid them all out across her living room, the bedroom, the hallway, everywhere there was flat space, and walked through her own home looking at them, all 33. Each one folded, each one tied with a length of natural twine, each one with a small handwritten tag attached that had the recipient's name in her careful handwriting. She sat down on the edge of her couch and looked at them for a while. She had been doing craft work her whole life, and she could look at what she made with a clear eye. These were the best things she had ever made, not because the stitching was perfect. She had made technically perfect things before, but because each one had been thought about, and the thinking was visible in the choices, and choices made with care for a specific person have a quality that choices made for a general person do not have. She could see it in the room around her, 33 different decisions made 33 different ways, because 33 different people deserved 33 different things. She called Jim and told him they were done. He said he would send the ranch truck on December 15th. She rode out to the ranch behind the truck, following it down a county road that ran straight through flat winter-brown land, the sky enormous and blue and cold the way it gets in the Panhandle in December. She had not been to this part of the county before. The ranch appeared gradually, first a water tower, then fence lines, then a cluster of outbuildings, then the main house, long and low with a covered porch that ran its entire width. Jim was on that porch when she pulled up. He came down the steps and helped carry the blankets in, which she had not expected, but which she noticed. A man who helps carry things without being asked is a man who thinks about what needs doing and does it rather than waiting to be directed. She appreciated that. He had arranged for the ranch families and the bunkhouse hands to come up to the main house that afternoon, framed as a general end-of-year gathering. So when Maggie arrived with 33 blankets and they were set out on the long dining table in the main room, the people coming in off the cold did not know what to expect. She stood to one side and watched. A mother lifted the cream and yellow blanket and then found the small infant-sized square tucked inside it and pressed it against her chest and did not say anything for a moment. The 32-year veteran picked up the burgundy and black one and turned it over in his hands the way someone handles something they recognize as serious work, the way you hold a good tool, and he said nothing but he nodded once in a way that Maggie understood completely. The teenage boy got handed the burnt orange one, and his face did this thing, very briefly, where it went from cool and trying not to show too much to genuinely moved, and then he got it back under control, but she had seen it. You couldn't unsee something like that. Children ran their hands across bright fabric. Old men held heavy blankets against the cold that came through the walls of even a well-built Texas farmhouse in December. Couples compared the ones they'd been given and talked about the colors. The woman who ran the accounts cried a little and then laughed at herself for crying. Maggie stepped out onto the porch because she needed some air. She stood in the cold and looked out at the empty winter pasture, and she cried, quickly and quietly, the way she did everything emotional, not making a scene of it, just letting it be what it was for a moment, and then breathing through it. She was not sure exactly why she was crying. Part of it was relief. The job was done and done well, and the thing she had feared about committing to something she might fail had not happened. She had not failed. Part of it was the faces she had just seen, the specific expressions of people receiving something that had been made with them in mind. And part of it was something harder to name, something about having spent 2 years making blankets in relative invisible quiet, and now standing on the other side of a moment where the work had been completely, unmistakably seen. She heard the door behind her, and Jim came and stood beside her, looking out at the same pasture. He did not say anything for a moment, which she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He gave things their proper amount of silence before he spoke. He said that Eleanor would have been glad to meet her. She did not know what to say to that, so she said thank you, and he nodded, and they stood there for another moment, looking out at the land. Then he told her something she was not prepared for. He said that he had shown 2 of the blankets, before today, to his sister, who managed a supply cooperative for ranch and farm businesses over in Amarillo. that his sister had looked at them carefully and asked who had made them, that he had told her about Maggie and the flea market and the commission, and that his sister had asked whether Maggie would consider supplying the cooperative's gift section on a regular basis. The cooperative had a small retail area that sold quality handmade goods to the farming families and ranch workers in the region, things that were actually useful, actually well-made, and locally sourced. Blankets like these would sell. His sister was confident of that. He said that personally, he wanted to continue a standing order, 1 blanket per month, for various purposes on the ranch. Birthday gifts for long-term staff, something for a new family when they arrived, that kind of ongoing need. And he said, and this was the thing that stayed with Maggie longer than anything else, you are not just surviving now, you are building something. Do not stop. She drove home that evening with a payment in her account that had cleared every overdue bill she owned, a standing order from Jim, a meeting scheduled with his sister for the following week, and a feeling in her chest where the stone used to be that was not the stone's opposite, not pure happiness because she was a realistic woman, but something more durable than happiness, something that felt like ground under her feet. The meeting with Jim's sister went well. She was a practical woman who asked direct questions and was satisfied with direct answers, and Maggie gave those. They agreed on terms, a standing supply of 8 to 10 blankets per month to the cooperative, at a price that was fair to both of them. The cooperative would handle the retail side. Maggie would handle the making. The blankets sold, all of them, before January was over. The cooperative reordered in February. Word moved through the region the way word moves in places where people are connected by real community, and not just geography. One of the ranch families who had received blankets at Christmas mentioned them to a neighbor. That neighbor called Maggie directly. Then another person called. By March she had a waiting list. Real customers with real orders. People who had heard from someone they trusted that there was a woman out on the panhandle who made the best blankets they'd ever held and who charged a fair price for them. She went to the Small Business Development Center in Amarillo, which Jim had mentioned offhandedly, in a way that made her think he had done his research before suggesting it. She sat across from a young advisor who was probably 20 years younger than her and who took her seriously from the first minute, and they talked about registering her business properly, about keeping accurate accounts, about the difference between being a person who sells things and being a person who runs a business. The distinction felt important. She registered the business. She opened a dedicated account. She named it Lone Star Warmth, because that is what it was. She fixed the truck in February. It was the first time in 3 years she had been able to take it to the mechanic and pay without calculating whether she could afford to eat afterward. The mechanic said the truck was old but solid and would run for years if she kept up with it. She drove home feeling a specific kind of freedom that only people who have gone without reliable transportation understand. The freedom of knowing that if something needs to happen, you can make it happen without asking anyone for a favor. In April, a 17-year-old girl from a family in the next county over came to the flea market, because Maggie still went to the flea market, not because she had to, but because she liked it, and because that was where she had always been most herself. And the girl stood at her table for a long time, asking careful questions about the stitching. She said she had learned a little from her grandmother, but had no one to learn from anymore. She asked if Maggie would ever consider teaching her. Maggie thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and said, "Saturday mornings. My place. Bring your own thread." The girl showed up the following Saturday with 3 spools of the wrong weight thread and such obvious eagerness that Maggie felt something she had not felt in a while, which was the specific pleasure of having something worth passing on and someone worth passing it to. Some months later, when her daughter came to visit from Houston, the first real visit in over a year, she came without the husband and with the baby, and they spent 4 days in the trailer that felt, for the first time in a long time, like exactly enough space. Maggie's daughter asked her about Jim, about how all of it had started. She asked carefully, because she was a perceptive young woman who had noticed that her mother said his name with a quality she did not use with most names. Maggie thought about how to answer that honestly. She said, "He did not rescue me." She wanted to be clear about that first. She had been rescuing herself, one $35 blanket at a time, for 2 years, before he ever showed up. She was capable of that. What he did was different. She said, "He stopped. He stopped at my table, and he actually looked at what I was making. Not a quick glance, not a polite look, but really looked. And then he responded to it the way you respond to something you recognize as real, with respect and with a fair offer. He did not pity me. He did not make me feel like a project or a charity case. He saw good work and he engaged with it the way good work deserves to be engaged with, and that changed what was possible, not because he gave me money, but because being seen clearly is one of the things that makes a person believe that what they're doing matters enough to keep doing." Her daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you in love with him?" Maggie laughed. She said, "He is a good man, and I respect him, and I am grateful for what he did. And those are different things. Let's leave it there." Her daughter let it go, though she did not seem entirely convinced. Jim, for his part, did not talk about Maggie's blankets the way other people did. His foreman noticed, that December and then again at Easter, when a ranch hand's wife received one for a birthday, that Jim handled the blankets differently from other objects, with a particular kind of care that went beyond simple respect for good craft. The foreman had known Jim for 15 years, and he knew better than to say anything about it out loud, but he noticed. What the foreman did ask about, once, when the two of them were fixing fence on a cold March morning, was the Christmas gathering. He said it had felt different this year, better, like something had come back into it. Jim said that Eleanor had always believed that a gathering was only as good as the thought that went into it, that if you brought people together without thinking about what each of them specifically needed from the occasion, you had organized a crowd and not a community. The blankets had been her way of thinking about each person specifically, of saying, "I know you are here, I see you, you belong in this place," the foreman said, "and now they're back." Jim said, "They were never really gone, they just needed someone to make them again." Then he went back to the fence, which was what he did when he had said everything he intended to say. There are things in this story that did not happen in a dramatic way. No one gave a speech. No one appeared on television. There was no single moment where music swelled and the camera pulled back to show two people in a wide-open landscape having a realization. Real life does not usually work like that, and this is a real story. What happened was slower and more durable than drama. A woman kept showing up and doing careful work when it would have been easier to stop. A man stopped walking and paid attention to something most people had walked past. A moment of genuine recognition, one person truly seeing what another person had made, created a small opening, and Maggie walked through it, and on the other side of it was a different life. Not a perfect life, not a problem-free life, but a life with ground under it, with purpose in the mornings, with something worth doing, and someone coming on Saturday mornings to learn how to do it too. The blankets are still being made. The cooperative in Amarillo still carries them. The waiting list has stayed steady at around 12 people since last spring. The flea market table is still there most weekends, because Maggie decided early on that she would not give up the place where she started, simply because she no longer needed it the way she once did. Needing something and valuing it are not the same thing, and she knew the difference. Jim still calls on Tuesdays and Fridays. Maggie still picks up. The girl from the next county over has gotten very good at the Lone Star pattern. Her center points are not yet as clean as Maggie's, but they are improving, and Maggie says very little about that because some things you learn by doing, and the doing is already happening. And somewhere in Amarillo, in a cooperative storeroom, there is a stack of hand-stitched blankets waiting to go home, with people who will put them on their beds or their couches and feel, without quite knowing why, that someone thought about them before they arrived. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing.